Carlton King, former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but actually really looks into geopolitics. And at its widest, I could say, that's basically everything that happens between countries, between peoples, and in your everyday life, how the state potentially tries to control you, or at least gives you the perspective that it believes you should have, in order for the people who run the state to be able to function quite easily and with the least friction. And that might be to the good of the citizens, but it may also not be. Well, for the last 2 weeks, I've been looking at Black History Month, and I did critical thinking specials on Black History Month. So I've been by myself, but now I'm back with my two favourite ladies. Now, I'm laughing because my podcast wife is going to start telling me that I'm being unfaithful. Madam, Lady Firgas Esak. But we've also got, like I said, my two favourite, the one and only Dr. Rachel back on the show, who's going to give us some in-depth neurological understanding as well. So thanks very much for listening again in advance. And as I say, if you want to actually inform us about anything that you've heard, anything that you want to talk about, any ideas that you might have, and obviously please do subscribe as well. But I just want people to feel free to come back to us. It's happening more and more, but I'd like to hear more of your thoughts about the show. So without any further ado, Fergus, take it away. What are we going to do this week?
Hi. I feel like giving you one of those virtual smacks around the face and being like, "Don't dare cheat on me." But fortunately, this particular menage a trois is also my favourite. So
yes,
in saying it's amazing to have Dr. Rachel back on the show. And I think it'll make this episode particularly insightful. Now, the background to this is a few weeks ago, we mentioned Gishlaine Maxwell in a podcast episode. And you said, oh, God, we must do this. We must talk about it. We must talk about it. Now, the Gishlaine Maxwell story is very complex, has been very prevalent in the media. There was also a Netflix program about it. And I think for better or for worse, from the society pages through to her trial, she was probably in and out of the papers for about 30 years. So I got on the phone to Dr. Rachel and I said, look, I think we'd like to do this episode, but I think that the listeners will be quite familiar with most of the details of the story. So what would be really interesting to Carlton and I would be to unravel the psychology behind some of the events. So I'm going to just let Dr. Rachel, I'm just going to welcome Dr. Rachel first of all, and then I think what I will do is I'll just kind of quickly run through the narrative, and then as an overview, and then we can pull out some interesting points, if that's all right with everyone.
Super.
Yep, great with me.
Fab. Right. So look, let's start at the top of the chain. Let's start with Robert Maxwell, who was Ghislaine's father. But he wasn't actually born Robert Maxwell, because he was of Czech descent. He had a fascinating career, to be honest. I mean, he escaped from Nazi occupation. His family were all killed, I think. I'm looking at you, Carlton, but I think all killed. He was a war hero. He was Jewish. He married a French Protestant. They had, I mean, I know I've got far too many children, but they had like 9, Ghislaine being the youngest. He obviously was a real grafter. I mean, he really, when he came to the UK, he kind of worked himself up. He changed his name. He was a Labour MP for a little bit, and he sort of started to buy up publishing companies. Now, full disclosure, I've worked for a couple of publishing companies that were or have previously been owned by members of the Maxwell family. And I would say that there is a legacy still in many of those newsrooms that extends from Maxwell's outlook, which was essentially work hard or you get sacked. Now, I know that might sound reasonably obvious, but in this day and age, there's a chain of HR, and there's a chain of well-being, and there's a chain of support, and you aren't allowed to just sack someone. But in those days, it was very much make a mistake and pack your bags and get out. And probably they'll probably throw you down the stairs as well. Anyway, so he started building up this media corporation, or this media empire, I suppose. This was kind of in the late 80s and 90s, and he started to take more and more control of the press, and he wanted to buy the Sun, but didn't, and in the end acquired the Mirror Group, which at the time was the Labour paper. And then he had a couple of other slightly less successful newspapers and companies. So he was in with Sinclair Computers, and he had a newspaper called The European, which didn't make it, although it's a shame because it was actually quite good. And he started buying theme parks and venues and stuff like that, right? So pretty powerful guy, very focused on work. When you hear Ghislaine, there were lots of references in the Netflix program that I didn't know but was quite shocked by, but can understand it. So, for example, Ghislaine was sort of recounting that all the children used to have to stand up at the dinner table and talk about what they'd achieved, and if the father wasn't happy with that, he would whip them with his belt.
What whip them
with his belt, and then they would have to write an apology letter to him for their own behaviour. He also, he dabbled in football as well. I think he tried to buy Man United at one point, unsuccessfully, but I think he did. Anyway, moving into the connection with Carlton's world. It was alleged that he was an agent. He had, as I say, he had served in the war, and he was an MP, and he was Israeli by descent. So I will, Carlton can expand on that when we get there. But just moving on with the story quickly, he allegedly in 1991 had a big argument with his youngest son because he defaulted on a huge amount of money, and he went off to Spain on his yacht, which was actually called the Lady Gishlaine, and he drowned. And apparently he was well, let's just say he was found naked in the sea. Reportedly he'd gone onto deck for a wee, but I'm just hypothesizing here that he might have been slightly inebriated. Anyway, so he drowned, right? We don't know if there was foul play, or all that happened was that, you know, they found him dead. Now, that moving on, so we move on to Gishlaine. Now, she was the youngest. She obviously was a devoted daughter. She obviously, you know, doted on her father, you know, wanted his attention, wanted to impress him. After the death, and prior to his death, she'd been a real socialite. She'd been one of those people that was on the party scene, seen as a fixer, seen as one of those people that, you know, she went to Oxford. She'd been at Oxford with Prince Andrew. She had lots of celebrity friends. You know, she was a party girl. She was always well groomed and wearing designer outfits. And anyway, the entire family weren't left with as much money as they thought they would have been. And she kind of obviously had a certain style of life. She had a certain lifestyle that was expensive. So she hooked up with this guy called Jeffrey Epstein, and he was essentially he represented billionaires in sort of hedge funds and money management, I suppose. He again had a very sort of checkered and interesting background. One of his was the guy that ran Victoria's Secrets. He had been investigated by the FBI for financial reasons, you know, before we even come on to the young girls. A little bit, you know, they were sort of always in the papers, very well connected. And then suddenly, seemingly, the tide turned a bit, and Gishlaine started being his, I don't know, madam, I suppose. Started scouting for young girls to please Jeffrey, and in the end, this was found out, and Jeffrey, you know, went to court and then went to prison first. Committed suicide in prison, and later Gishlaine was tried and convicted. Now, this is a really, really, really brief romp through what we all know in great detail, because we haven't even touched on Prince Andrew's involvement either. But I think your listeners are quite familiar with the story, so I think it's fair to say that we can just sort of pick out the bits that are of personal interest, and dissect and discuss those.
Yeah, I mean that sounds a great overview. I would just add one little. He was basically charged twice. The first time, some 4 or 5 years before, where Gishlaine had aided and assisted him to get younger women or young girls to his place in Florida. And as a state offence, he was looked at by the Floridians and found guilty. But he never really served, well, I'll be precise, he never served a night in prison. He was sentenced, but I think to 5 years or something, but he never served a night in prison. He basically was allowed to go to prison between the hours of, I think it's something like 10 and, let's say, 6 or something like that, and then he could go home. Which was
also,
something that,
didn't they set him up like a home office? He had it was sort of like work from home version, like 1.0, wasn't it?
Correct. It was dodgy from day one. Now,
and Carlton, just because I'm interested in this, is there a precedent for this kind of incarceration, or was this to your knowledge, the first time somebody had been imprisoned in this sort of way?
Well, I don't know the system in every state of the United States. So, I mean, that's how you can probably get around it. You're basically saying it's like a house arrest, but with you going to jail for the period. I think that's quite abnormal when you look at the American system, particularly down in those southern places like Florida. They have a lot of people in really tense, drastic, really, prisons, or I would say they don't look after their prisoners. So why this guy gets this kind of exception where he does turn up, but he gets separate kind of quarters from everybody else nigh on, and never sleeps there overnight. I don't understand how that happened. I can't say it's never happened before. It's just extremely changed, especially when he's been basically perceived as a sex offender. So you got to question that. But yeah, so anyway, no, please do carry on and let's bring in the doctor.
Let's bring in the doctor because she said, she gave us a comment on a previous episode, and I think that actually Dr. Rachel would probably recommend that for the sake of well-being and mental health, everybody's incarceration experience was similar to this rather than being locked in a cold dark prison cell. But to your point, he was convicted of a sex crime.
Well, I think what's interesting about that scenario is from a psychological perspective, you can look at how he was treated, and it was almost like it was paying a bit of lip service that they had to be seen to do something, but also that he wielded enough power to make sure that something didn't really interrupt his daily life. And I suppose that is a really interesting concept, given the whole nature of everything that you've sort of described, Firgas, in that we're looking at an extreme model of power and control with all of this, that we have men who exert huge amounts of power over other people and go to the nth degree to actually maintain that control. And everybody within their world will have had felt the force of that, and to a certain degree will have played their own part in maintaining this whole image of power and control.
Well, that's a really, really good point. And one of the things that I would like the listeners to think about as we talk through this is, was everybody involved, did everybody involved commit a crime to the same level? And actually, like, who's accountable? Who should have been accountable? And should other people have stepped in a bit earlier? When you watch the documentary, there are quite a few of Jeffrey Epstein's friends who say things like, oh, we knew he liked schoolgirls, or, we knew Ghislaine was scouting for girls, or, we knew he took girls to his island or his ranch or wherever. Should they have stepped in earlier? I'm asking this as an open question, really, for listeners to think about as we talk about all of this.
Let me just say one thing before you guys go into that perspective. You mentioned he was a trader and where he ended up with his billions. Actually, from the way I understand it, he hooked up with an old guy who, in the end, left him his billions. So, and it's a little bit hazy in the beginning how he made his connections. I'm not saying he was a rent boy. I'm not saying that. For people not in the United Kingdom, a gay, how would you put it, a gay prostitute. I'm not saying that's what he was, because I don't know if the monetary perspective was like that, so cut and thrust and the same. But it would appear as though he, and I say, appear, so I can't say 100%, but from when you read more about him, as though he gave his sexual favours to men for wealth at one stage, and then became wealthy. And he was kept by the guy from Victoria's Secret. He was kept by him in the beginning.
He's called.
I mean, that's a really nice sort of segue into, you know, what I was going to comment on, because I think, you know, from what Firgas was saying, you know, about the people around it, we have to remember that the human brain constantly does cost-benefit analysis on how to behave in a situation, how to view a situation, and this will, you know, go for Epstein himself. You know, we weigh up, we see, and based on our own integrity, our own values, on how we want to be part of a situation or not. And, you know, I've maintained in every single sort of sex scandal that explodes when it comes, you know, we'll have exploitation, we'll have somebody in power who is seen to be manipulating or exploiting somebody with less power themselves, that they can't possibly do this without the enablers. And anybody who is party to the situation, whether they're supportive of it or not, is an enabler if they're not actively doing something to say that this behaviour is not acceptable in our society, this behaviour is not something we expect in our circle of friends, in our circle of influence. You know, so very much so that all these people come out after the events because now they've done a cost-benefit analysis and it benefits them to speak out against it or speak out about it. But at the time, they did that analysis and it was better for them to keep quiet and keep him within his circle of influence. And, you know, we have to recognize that this is, you know, very much a human function, and it's underpinned by what, you know, people can get out of it. Now, it saddens me because human beings are capable of so much better than that. But if you have a circle of influence where the integrity is not valuing humanity, not valuing, you know, being just, being honest, being respectful, then you're going to have like a whole community, you know, where it is based on this power and control model. And it's who can get the most out of it, who can benefit from it the most. What do I need to do to actually raise my profile, raise my status within this group? That's what it'll have all been about.
Yeah, but also,
and I'm saying it's not gender specific. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying it's not gender specific because you could argue that he was abused, but is he abused? Or has he just done, as you said, the calculation that said, hey, this will get me up the ladders, or your cost benefit analysis?
Yeah, well, I think actually it's you know, aside from the abuse, it's my personal opinion that Jeffrey Epstein sort of always thought that he was above the law. You know, I mean, aside from his you know, his inheritance, he, you know, his business was essentially like tax fraud for wealthy people, or tax evasion, I suppose. So he already had these people kind of under his control a little bit, just because, you know, he was sort of, you know, because he was laundering their taxes, I suppose, or you know, whatever. So he already had that sort of financial coercion. But is
that not a metaphor for the United States?
Well, yeah, it probably is. But you know, the like, let's say this, you know, to play devil's advocate as I always do, if that client knew that he was soliciting schoolgirls, but that particular client was also having having all their taxes happily, you know, trotting away to you know, the Virgin Islands or whatever, like, you know, that the last thing they're going to do is open their mouth. I mean, he also had this like Ponzi scheme business going on, and again, you know, those people involved knew that they were breaking the law, but because he sort of thought he was above the law, and, you know, the last thing they were going to do was out him for his relationship with schoolgirls, when, you know, when there was that sort of pyramid chain that he could have actually incriminated them. So I think it was that, you know, I feel like that there's a huge parity. I mean, you know, I know it's I know it's very obvious, and it's really easy to sort of say, oh, daddy issues or whatever, but there's a very obvious parity between Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. And I know this is something that the press have drawn on lots of times, and I think there's there are biographies written with this theme. But I think the fact that when people with a lot of wealth are playing with the law, I feel like they feel like they can play with their relationships as well. And again, I'm throwing this one back to Dr. Rachel because they feel like they've got power, but they've also, because they've got dirt on people, they've got control, and therefore it sort of pushes their own problems under the rug, I suppose, or their own vices under the rug, should we say.
Well, yeah, and I think the other thing to consider with all of this is sort of the behaviours are extreme. They're not within sort of the norm of, the average Joe here. So in every aspect of life, their behaviours are extreme. And what we need to sort of understand as well about the brain is that we get habituated to certain events, certain experiences where we will not get the same kind of arousal. And what we tend to do then is start pushing the boundaries to get that similar initial arousal. So if you have somebody whose behavior is extreme to begin with, and that becomes habituated, they're constantly going to be looking for the next big thing, the next, sort of boundary crushing, experience to maintain that level of the old dopamine hit and endorphins in their brain. And the more they get away with, the more that it emboldens them. And you're quite right in thinking, that because of the power and control that they hold, and again, you're going back into this sort of cost benefit analysis and the people that they control within their sphere is that, inevitably they do feel that they are above the law because they do not function and they do not maneuver in the same way as everybody else, in real life actually does, because their lives are just quite surreal. They don't follow the normal patterns. They don't follow the cultural norms, the social etiquette that the majority of people do.
But here's a controversial question for Dr. Rachel, right? You have always said that neuropsychology is a way of narrating the fact that our ancestors had it right all along.
Yeah.
If you were a tribe leader back in those days, if you were the head of the tribe, it would have been acceptable to procreate with the teenage girls because they would have probably been at the height of their ability to reproduce an heir.
Yeah.
Well, it's not just the tribe leader. It's not just the tribe leader. It's the whole society. I mean, you've got to be realistic. If you go, you just need to read Romeo and Juliet, okay, to see that. Yeah. What are they, 14? Yeah. So it's just that we put on what is accepted and what isn't accepted.
Yeah.
When I say we, the state, the system, right, puts that on. And the other thing is, they are above the law as a general rule. You see, you're fooling yourself if you think that there is one law for Joe Soap man sitting in the street begging for a penny or two, and the guy sitting in the Rolls Royce. There isn't. I mean, people and this idea of justice being blind is a total utter nonsense. It's not real. It's not real. Absolutely. It's there to con the people. The reality is, if you come into court with 2 or 3 top lawyers, right, you are probably walking away rather than Joe Soap coming into court with nobody and just depends upon, in our country, they provide them with some sort of legal backup, who's got 15, 30, 50 other cases, doesn't care less about what's going on potentially, and frankly, they're never going to get the job done. So the United States is a prime example of it. This is why I said it. You can go in the United States, go in front of a court, and the judge will say, we can give you bail. There's a program called Khalif Browder, right? You should watch it. And basically, he's a young lad who was said that he happened to be a black lad, which makes it even worse, said that he'd committed a crime, which he never did, but he was put into Rikers Island prison, right? because he could not afford the bail of, I think it's $600, right? The case kept going to court for 2 years, right? And the state kept saying, we don't have the evidence because the individual who saw the offence, we can't find him. And judges just said, okay, 45 days, then come back. And every time he's put back into prison, right? Because he hasn't got 600 quid, right? Or in those days, it probably would have been 400 quid with exchange rate. So he's put back into prison each time. And in prison, of course, because it's a hellhole, he's got to defend himself. So he starts defending himself, and lo and behold, he's then getting offences because he's defended himself and caught defending himself. So you see how the system racks against you. In the end, watch the programme, it's harrowing, right? Because the lad's done nothing. He never did anything. And basically the detectives were under the DA, the DA's running the case, the detectives were basically saying, oh, we don't know where the person is, purely and simply because they couldn't be bothered in the end. There's just more and more cases coming through, and so he's probably done it. But the bloke was never went to Mexico who was supposed to give the evidence, and it wasn't him who committed the offence. So that would never have happened to anybody with any money, because you'd have paid your let's call it $1,000, but it was about $600, and you wouldn't have spent a day in prison. You wouldn't have spent a day in prison. So this is the point. They are above the law. They know it. They know they can get away with most things. And the other thing is, Dr. Rachel, I ask you this question. Is it really the case that they're doing extreme things? Or is it, I'll give you another example. There's a woman known as Madame, you know, my memory, as I told you, is terrible. Anyway, she was in, still in the slave era of Louisiana. So that's before 1861 and the proclamation. And so it's before the Civil War. And basically, if you own slaves, it's your property, so you do what you want with them. But there was this understanding for most people that you don't chop their arms off unless they've done something wrong. When they do something wrong, chop their arms off, not a problem. But you don't chop their arms off, hammer their fingers, break their toes, sew up their mouth. And all these types of things she was doing. She had an above floor where she basically had a whole lot of people, just kept them alive, but she'd go up there and cut the skin off them ever so often, etc., 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 because she could get away with it. Now, people in the community, in her community, she was wealthy in her community, said they had these thoughts that, oh, she was doing this to slaves, you know, but they weren't sure. But it wasn't the bother that she was doing it to slaves, really. The bother was that it might put them all in a bad light, and slaves may then think, well, we might as well die to save ourselves. So because we're going to suffer this. In other words, you don't want to make the people restless.
Well, actually, right, Madame LaLaurie, she was called, wasn't
Yes, that's her.
Yeah.
That's her.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is that was normal activity. It's just that she did it in a way that they didn't like. So my point is to Rachel is, what is normal? And what isn't normal?
Can I just jump in, because I've got a biological question that I just want to ask Dr. Rachel here. Okay, so the girls, like the victims, you know, the ones who were named, the ones who weren't named, and they kind of all came out and they told their stories and all the rest of it. And again, I think, you know, the listeners are quite familiar with many of them. You know, however, my question is, in the documentary, Elaine sort of says, or she tries to justify her position by saying, Jeffrey needs to have 3 orgasms a day, and, you know, I can't keep up with him, and I'm too old for it. I mean, I think the implication was like she was too old and boring, because you know, they sort of said, oh, you know, they stopped being a couple and they started just being, you know.
Well, I thought she was involved in it as well. I thought she was actually involved in the sexual acts in the beginning as well.
She was in the beginning, but then they stopped dating or being together, and they, you know, like,
I'm talking about with the girls.
But look, the biological question that Right, the biological question that I want to ask Dr. Rachel, right, is that if you've got, circling back to the reproduction, you know, these girls being sort of in their prime for reproduction, and, you know, circling back to the tribal elders thing, right? If this guy is having 3 orgasms a day, right, I'm not being naughty, I'm just being biological here, but you know, surely he would be quite fertile, even, you know, and for these girls, right, what surprised me is out of everyone who gave evidence and everyone who testified and everyone who sort of talked about their experience of being sexually abused, nobody actually fell pregnant. And if you think about all the you know, if you think about the way that celebrities are quite often caught out for having affairs, because you know Noel Gallagher, for example, is a classic example, but because somebody gets themselves pregnant, but you know, I'm not saying they get themselves pregnant deliberately, but you know, that's the crux of their case, right? These girls sort of came through, you know, 20, 25 years later and testified, but nobody was impregnated by him, and nobody mothered a child for him, which would have been sort of the ultimate proof that this had happened. Now, I'm not saying that Ghislaine wasn't sort of, you know, giving them the contraceptive pill at the door, but if they were clever and wanted to call this out, like so many celebrity baby mothers have done subsequently, you know, like historically, right? Then surely it might have occurred to one of them to not take that contraceptive pill. I know this is a sort of, you know, I'm just sort of spitballing here, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because in all the court evidence, they always just sort of refer to sexual acts. There's lots of talking about breast touching and intimate touching and all the rest of it, but I wonder if he actually had penetrative sex with any of them, or if they just felt violated in a different way.
Well, you know, for me, it was a well-oiled machine. So with the purpose and intention of it absolutely not being about having progeny to be produced from it. So I would imagine that was pretty much part of the grooming process, part of the initiation into, you know, this inner enclave, that it would be, you know, there would be no chance at all of these girls getting pregnant, whether there was penetrative sex or not. I mean, the girls themselves, you know, the background of the majority of them is that, you know, you can see that there are attachment issues going right the way back to childhood, you know. So when you are dealing with that, and Ghislaine herself, she had, you know, attachment issues because of the relationship with her father. You know, definitely there'd be sort of what we call from the attachment world of having insecure avoiding and anxious avoiding attachment, in that there's, you know, there's nothing stable there. It's easy to be manipulated. It's easy to be controlled because of your blueprint of how relationships happen, and I think you cannot underestimate the power of that. And when you're talking sort of about you know, abusive behavior, it's a behavior that causes harm and distress to the individual who is experiencing it. And you know, there's, you know, sort of the psychological process is that when it's happening to you, it might be so normalized, it might be, you know, you might be so desensitized to it that actually you only realize sort of years down the line that actually it was harmful and distressing for you. And it, you know, from everything that has been sort of in the narrative around all of this, it's not just, you know, going out into the street and picking girls off the street and that's it. They go and have their time with Epstein and that's that. There appears to be a whole psychological process of, you know, grooming, of keeping these girls in the inner enclave, And that's a completely different sort of psychological process, rather than some of these, maybe these celebrity baby mothers who, they're going out, they have a very short relationship. The celebrity themselves doesn't even, think, because they're not thinking, are they? It's all about lust. And then there's a baby at the end of it. This is something completely different to that. It's kind of comparing apples with pears, if you will.
See, I thought there were two different elements. I thought he had, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not in depth as you guys are on this. I thought he had people that were just local girls from around the area who he said, you're going to get paid X amount of money, or she said to them, or somebody else. Actually, they had girls who they'd asked to do it on their behalf. You're going to get paid $1,000 just to come up, and this old geezer, and all you need to do for him is you just need to massage him.
No, Carlton, no. I
thought just 1 second. I thought that was one set. That was one set of girls, and that was a set that he was done for. Then there was the other set of girls who went higher, who went then the ones that they took to the island, etc., etc. And there were many other people there on these islands of which things happened. So there was two sets. There was basically the ephemeral set, who just turned up and did X, Y, and Z, massaged and did more, whatever they did. Whatever they did is down to them. And then they had another set who they kept for a longer period of time, like the girl pictured with Prince Andrew. So there's two lots. I don't think there's just one lot. And a second thing that I want to put and ask for you, I'm wondering whether what Epstein's position was, and I put this to you, Dr. Rachel, was that he was trying to prove that he's not gay.
I mean, the thing, the intricacies of it are such that it doesn't strike to me that is the case. I don't think he cared whether he was gay or not. I think he was just an opportunist who used people for his own gains and his own.
Sorry, let me explain why I say that. Because there's a lot of talk in the initial stages of him making his way up, when he involves himself in and lives with, in fact, the fella from Victoria's Secrets. Up to that point, he's in that sort of sphere. Then, of course, once he makes his own, you don't hear anything more about him being in the sphere of gay people. Then he changes. So this is the point why I'm saying that. Why has he changed?
Because maybe it wasn't about his sexual preferences. It's always been about power and control and what he can get.
Exactly, about the money.
Yeah. It was never about sexual preferences, power and control, and especially with sexual exploitation, it's not about the sex. It's about feeling that control and having power over people. It's very much about hubris. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And you can go back to every eon and historical era, and you will find examples of this. It's a very human trait, and sort of going back to a discussion point earlier when we were talking about what is normal, in that. But generally what's perceived as normal is what is sort of the verbal social contract of where you live, your society where you live. So the normal within the UK is around about 18 somebody becomes an adult, and then they can do certain things. Before that they're a child, so they're viewed as completely different. That's the social norm, the social etiquette.
That's the social etiquette today.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Today.
It wasn't necessarily the social etiquette 30 years ago, but it is today.
Exactly, but it is today. And that's what, when you're talking about norms, social norms, and we have some social norms in this country that I'm not completely comfortable with, but it's like they view it as that's your social contract for living in the society that you do. Now, I completely agree with you, Carlton, that if you have a certain amount of power, control, money, then the social norms don't actually, you don't follow them. They're not for you, are they? They're not meaning
Correct.
for you. They're for all the minions who are below you. And that's, part of this. And when a story is sensationalized, like the whole of this, there's part of me that actually examines all the psychology of the narrative around it. And I just wonder why people can't see through it, that they can't see past the sensationalism. And actually, what the truth of the matter is with all of this is that to the rich and the powerful, the rest of us are just dispensable. You know, we're just disposable. They can do what they want with us. They can use us and then just throw us away. And whether that's just, you know, through sexual favors or through taxes or through working our fingers to the bone to make them rich through their companies, it's all the same. It's all power and control and manipulation of the majority by the minority.
Absolutely. No, you see, this is why I mentioned what I mentioned. But what can happen is, and this is why I said, is it because he's trying not to be, or because he was saying that's not the right thing? In the United States, particularly the more south you go, the more you have a Christian perspective. Now, what does that really mean? It means that you show a certain way of living. Doesn't mean to say you do live that way. It means you show a certain way of living, right? You turn up at church on a Sunday. You have to be there. You know, you would not get voted in to be the president of the United States if you say I'm not a Christian. It won't happen, right? Because that's you finished now, overnight, and you don't believe in Christianity. So that's you done. It's over. So what I'm saying is, if he made his way up in a much more liberal state like New York, right, and he did certain things in New York, once you're living down south, you've now got to show a different face, even if you're very, very wealthy, because the people that you're with have that certain perspective. Yeah, they know behind the closed doors that they do what they want, but to the people outside, you've got to show a certain face. And what I'm saying is that if you want to be within a certain society, maybe that's what you had. Maybe what you did previously was unacceptable to that society. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. You know, and that's to a certain extent, you know, unless you've got solid integrity and principles that you're prepared to die for, you know, which not many people do have. Not many people know what they stand for anymore or know what they value. You know, to a certain degree, that most people will be that flexible, you know, about changing themselves to fit in with whatever the norms are of that time. And then you get the minority who won't, who actually just said, no, that's not my normal, that's not how I want to live, and I'll die by the sword kind of thing. You know, so it's like for the majority is that you do tend to be chameleon and tend to fit in. And there's also a great driver in human beings in that we have a driving, burning desire to be part of a group. Sure. And to be part of a group, you have to accept the social norms. And if some people are not part of those social norms, turn a blind eye because it's, you know, not my circus, not my monkeys. You know, or you get the other side of it where there'll be a few people who, you know, really want to fight to keep the social etiquette, the social norms of that group, and actually say to people, no, you don't behave like that, this is how you behave. But again, you know, we have to sort of look at the relationship with money that we have in the West. And it's very plain to everybody that the more money you have, the more power you wield. You get invited to all the policy conferences, you get invited to all the top parties, you know, you get invited to make decisions. Even if you're, you know, an unelected person, you can, you know, lobby and persuade and influence. And, you know, that is how we function. So the relationship with money is a huge part of that. And you know, when you were sort of talking about earlier that, you know, girls were enticed into the enclave, you know, with money. For most of these girls, $1,000 or, you know, is a huge amount of money.
Yeah, it's a lot of money, absolutely.
And gets back to that cost benefit analysis. You know, you're told you go and massage and you get $1,000, and it's just yeah.
Exactly, but also let's not ignore like the circle of friends, right? Because he was sourcing those girls for the circle of friends and then blackmailing them. So he had cameras everywhere in his his mansions, and he'd be bringing these girls in, and he'd be bringing these wealthy people in, and he'd be videoing them, and then he was sort of sitting on the evidence and kind of saying so it wasn't just power, it was like actual blackmail, really.
Well, was he blackmailing them, or was he, and this is where we're, or was he playing both sides? Now,
Well,
this is where you come a little bit into my world, in the fact that I think I've no real proof on this, other than the way that he was treated and what the prosecutor said in Florida. The prosecutor in Florida, when he didn't do what a normal person would have got, said there are higher authorities that are suggesting where Epstein should be. And when you then look at Epstein's island in particular, not the ranch, but the island in particular, if you look at the people who went to that island, and I'm talking primary people, I'm talking the most powerful people in the world, okay? Politicians of the most powerful, I'm not going to say most powerful politicians in the world, who ran the most powerful country in the world, right? Let's put it that way, and other countries. You will see who may well have been interested in what Epstein was doing, and hence why Epstein was getting off. Then, when you look to his death, you will see that he had supposedly, I say advisedly, supposedly, or allegedly, tried to commit suicide on one occasion. Okay? It did not work. So then, and he was already on suicide watch. So then he's on suicide watch still, and he gets and is able to commit suicide. So why does that happen? Why is Epstein, one, trying to commit and he's on suicide watch and he could nigh on do it? And secondly, he actually does it when he's on suicide watch. And nobody really knows why nobody knew.
But
to me, that suggests way above and beyond.
Like a year before he hanged himself, right, he said to the New York Times, he said, I've got all the CDs of all of this evidence, right? I've got all of this, right? Like, buy it off me.
What he said was basically, I know things, okay, that are problematic, right? Now, there's two ways to deal with that. Either he gets out or he doesn't ever get out. Right? And the way that looked to me, one mistake of a fella on suicide watch, where they've got a person supposedly outside the door, yeah, one mistake, okay, can happen. You would think that once the attempted suicide didn't work, everybody would be chastised in that prison, and it would make sure for normal people that they would, normal prison warders, that would never happen again. Right? Now it happens again. All when he's about to go into court and talk again. This thing does not sit well. And you just need to look at who went to the island. All listeners, I would suggest you look at who went to that island, the type of people going to that island, and then you may well understand. And then you also may understand the statement of higher, from the first Florida guy, higher authorities have suggested to me.
And this is what makes me feel so dispirited and disappointed in humanity. And I know, that's probably coming across as a little bit trite, is that, from the capacity of human beings, it's like we are capable of so much. We really are. And yeah, en masse, we allow this kind of behavior to go on. Everybody sits and wants to be entertained by the media. They want to be distracted. They want all of this. And, and the price of that is that there's some deep depravity that actually is not allowing human beings as a species to advance, we're actually going backwards. We're regressing, because we're actually saying, oh, this is, it's a bit like, the women knitting, watching the executions during the French Revolution. It's like, oh, let me be entertained. It's like, no, start challenging these people who are your supposed leaders, because as you say, Carlton, the kind of people who are going to the island, of course they knew what was going on. They were going there to be entertained, whatever form of entertainment that is. That's why they were going. They were going to be entertained, and they were going to power broke or, whatever else. And if you believe that you live in a democracy, which does make me laugh, people need to understand that the roots of the word democracy, power to the people. What kind of power do you have, people? You have
people
nothing.
Don't have any power already.
Yeah, we have nothing. We have nothing.
People
so stop saying you live in a democracy. Democracy only works in it came from ancient Athens with a population of 100,000, and it was tricky for the 100,000 to have power to the people.
Exactly.
Stop kidding yourself that you think you live in a democracy, and look to your leaders. What integrity do they have? Because the majority of them will have been to the island and will have been entertained by Epstein and Gishlaine.
So that was part 1 of this week's Black Spy podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll have part 2 next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes, or Google Patreon Black Spy Podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
More than a quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.